Dune Part 2 has more flaws than audiences and critics are talking about. Although considered an excellent movie, Dune Part 2 does have some flaws, including a major plot contrivance I highlighted in my first Dune Part 2 video. Welcome back. I'm David Luce of Several Daves. Happy to have you here. When Dune Part 2 first came out, I started hearing that it's the best sequel, on par with other epics like Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, or Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back. These comparisons didn't prompt me to see the movie. I was already going to see it because I really liked the first one. Common criticisms of the first movie usually touched on pacing. For me, the pacing and ending of the first movie were a positive feature. However, Dune Part 2's pacing is worthy of further criticism, even more than the first movie. Now, full disclosure, I have not read the books, which I know is borderline criminal because they're classics, and because I'm talking about the adaptations, and because I'm an author myself. My book is actually sitting right over there, at least a test copy. The point is, I'm not going to talk about the differences between the books and the movies because I haven't read the books. Now, the consistent pacing of the first movie left some bored, but all of the narrative threads were adequately covered. Dune Part 2's pacing was not consistent, and the narrative was unable to handle this contrast. Whether you like the first movie's pacing, here's something people can agree upon. Something is off about Dune 2's pacing. Just so we're on the same page, narrative pacing is broadly defined as the pace or frequency at which a story unfolds. It's not always so straightforward, despite the term being used often. People may also be referring to narrative flow when they're describing narrative pace, but that's a different video. We'll stick with pacing since that's the common term. Some common forms of bad pacing may force a narrative to leave a point of interest in the main story to venture into a side story for so long that the impact of the main story point is no longer as relevant. Or maybe there's too many dialogue dumps that bog down the pacing, maybe even characterization, where you fold layers into a character and bring them to life, which is considered a very good thing, may come at the cost of valuable screen time, which causes important events to get crunched in the final act. Hint, hint. After the last video, some of my commenters got me thinking. Thank you for that. I think the pacing between the first two acts and the final act is the most jarring. At first, the main focus is on Paul Atreides integrating into the Fremen society, which helps build his ascension. Then, in the final act, all the buildup is released. This release was very effective for some narrative threads. I like the theme of power throughout the entire series so far, particularly the theme of empathy giving way to apathy upon a change in perspective. Throughout the movie, Paul was so hesitant to walk the path of his visions, which would have him go south, rally the rebels, and lead them to war, in which many would likely die. Some people don't like the abrupt change in his demeanor, but I think it's okay. I actually like it a lot, despite it not adhering to the books. Here's why. In so many other stories, characters change while trying to obtain power. Think Walter White of Breaking Bad, Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Shakespeare's Macbeth, and many more. In Dune Part 2, Paul Atreides does not seek power, he seeks revenge. And maybe to achieve revenge, he needs power, but he dreads what may come of achieving power. Paul is driven upon the path of his visions by the actions of those who surround him, those with more power, namely Feyd-Rautha of the Harkonnens. Specifically, once Feyd-Rautha destroys a Fremen stronghold in Holy Site, Paul is driven south, leading a demoralized battalion of Fremen rebels, where he drinks the water of life, or for us laymen, the worm blood, which is against the law for a man to do. Unlike those other characters, Walter White, Anakin Skywalker, and the rest, who undergo gradual changes in pursuit of power, Paul abruptly and dramatically changes into a very different person. He's arrogant, aggressive, direct, selfish. Why? In Dune Part 2, and in much of life, a change in scale of an individual's perspective on life can change their priorities. It could change the way they think, the way they talk, the way they treat with people, the way they are perceived by other men, by other women. Think how mastering a job and earning money changed your life. Now imagine receiving the power Paul received. What Paul gained was perspective. His visions became longer and more coherent. He could see the future. He could see the past. He could experience the genetic memories of not just his female ancestors, like the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, but also his male genetic memories, which the Reverend Mother does not have access to. Paul went from being one of the Fremen to encompassing them. He went from a Windows XP laptop to artificial general intelligence. He went from an individual to a civilization. Paul gained the power of a god. The change was in scale, in knowledge, in capability, and it all happened very quickly. The progression was not in capabilities as a leader and a military strategist. In fact, there wasn't a progression. This change was a disruption, sudden and brutal, almost killing Paul. It took him from a caring individual who doubted and hated the prophecy he was within to an aggressive tyrant for which the ends justify the means, now enthralled by his own capabilities. There's also something to be said about the greater powers sowing the seeds of their own destruction, not just the obvious instance with the Bene Gesserit, when Irulan and the Reverend Mother openly discuss how they prepared the Fremen with tales of the Muad'Dib, thus creating the very rebels they're now fighting. But we see it again with the Harkonnens unknowingly driving Paul straight into a destiny he was trying to avoid. This, of course, is what ultimately leads to their downfall. As an aside, there is an odd indication connected to this theme, a bit more of a plot point. It's a question as to what the Reverend Mother, Mohiam, meant when confronted about advising Emperor Carino to destroy the Atreides in the first movie, and yet requesting that the Harkonnens spare Jessica and Paul, which of course the Harkonnens refused. When Mohiam admits she advised the attack, Jessica tells her she chose the wrong side. Mohiam says there are no sides. Perhaps we'll get more on this in a later movie, but for now, it does seem contradictory given she was against Paul as the Muad'Dib, or the Kwisatz Haderach, as the Bene Gesserit call the prophesied one. Probably butchering that. Let's see. Anyway, I like these thematic progressions, but as you can tell, the movie is far from perfect. Even with all the great things it does. What the movie developed in narrative build-up, namely with the Feyd-Rautha Harkonnens' screen time and Paul integrating into the Fremen society, does not bode well for the other several narrative threads tying off in the final act. I've talked about how Emperor Carino suddenly became stupid when challenged by Paul. That's the most egregious plot issue in the movie, so check out my first Dune video for that. That part aside, the pacing contrast between the first two acts and the final act is not just abrupt, but also very disruptive to narrative coherence. At first, the movie's main focus is on Paul integrating into the Fremen society, which helped build his ascension, and Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen's own ascension to the primary Baron. Then, all the buildup is released. It's very effective for some narrative threads, but not others. The narrative threads that suffered most are between Emperor Carino, the Great Houses, and the final mounting conflict. The motives are not clear, and therefore the stakes are not clear. Now we can deduce a little bit of the motives at play here between Emperor Carino, the Great Houses, and Paul's rebellion, but not much. We know there's a tenuous alliance across the Empire, but the movie didn't give us much to chew on. As one commentator mentioned, why did the Baron accept audience with the Emperor when he already sent word to the Great Houses with high hopes that they will turn against Emperor Shaddam? He played his final card, yet risked his life by answering the Emperor's call. The pacing also threw me away. Not only did the Emperor arrive on Arrakis, but the great houses were in orbit soon after. It would have been much better to have the Baron send the word somewhat prior to Shaddam arriving, so that the Emperor's animosity towards the Baron would have been justified through his sheer confusion of why there are fleets scheduled to arrive in orbit. This commenter raises a good point. The pacing at the end served to escalate tension, but it undid the established tension of the Baron summoning the great houses to intimidate or attack the Emperor. The movie could have certainly shown why the Baron met with the Emperor under such circumstances. But to be fair, the Emperor does have enough reason to be upset with Baron Harkonnen for failing to regain control of Arrakis. But imagine the Emperor learns this same man has summoned a massive fleet against him too. If the Harkonnens really believed Emperor Corrino was responsible for the rebellion on Arrakis, then not enough screen time was dedicated to clarifying this point. Thus, summoning the great houses is a bit of an odd choice. As it stands, there was nearly no reaction or gravitas to the great house's arrival anyway. This is definitely a lost opportunity. As the commenter mentions, it would have been better to have summoned the great houses earlier in the movie, have them arrive in orbit around Arrakis while the Emperor is there, and then draw impact from the Emperor's reaction to their surprise arrival. Furthermore, if the great houses are against Emperor Corrino taking over Arrakis, presumably because of the concentration of power over a vital resource, then they should be in favor of Paul stopping the Emperor. But if they're not in favor of Paul as the Emperor, the movie should have explained why, or at least set up the choice the houses have to make so it's more clear to the audience. This is a great example of how pace and flow can impact narrative coherence. In screen time, about 20 or 30 minutes goes by from the time the great houses are summoned, the Emperor is challenged, the Emperor arrives on Arrakis, and the great houses must decide on Paul as the Emperor. All that buildup, all that concentration, but the payoff is filtered way down because of screen time. Overall, the character and group motivation development for this movie missed the mark, especially beyond Arrakis. This is largely due to the pacing of the movie spending too much screen time on building narrative threads and releasing them without enough screen time to satisfy the payoff. If you take all the narrative threads and imagine them as separate paths in a forest, then some paths are easy to tread and have been paved with smooth asphalt by the end. Others remain scraggly and barely visible. Specifically, I would rather have had more focus on the great houses and the Emperor dynamic to give the final conflicts and decisions more weight instead of a prolonged ascension for Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen. Also, we could have trimmed the deep dive into the relationship with Chani and the Fremen society. I like those scenes. The narrative threads are necessary as well. I like the world building, characterization, emotional attachment, and threat of escalation, but we also need a coherent finish with the Emperor at the climax. A bit more balance might have been best here. I get the feeling this narrative structure would be better suited for a show. Yet even then, a show like Game of Thrones sacrificed character consistency, narrative flow, and satisfying conclusions to a truncated pacing. So who knows? Let's leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. Comment, like, and subscribe, and share if you dare. I've been David Luce, and you've been great.